Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another exciting Propagandacaster Addendum with me, your host, Imperial Dane, Master of Propaganda. And today's topic, I want to talk about RNG. Specifically, I want to talk about a particular part of RNG, which tends to get sort of ignored a lot. When we talk RNG, most people just sort of like, oh man, that's so RNG, or RNGs and all that, and they'll just leave it at that. But the problem is, it's not so much that there's RNG in companies and companies 2 that's the issue. In fact, companies 1 also had a bunch of it, but there's a particular difference there between companies 1 and companies 2 in a particular area, and that's variance. And you might ask, well, what's variance specifically? I mean, imagine you're flipping a coin. Now imagine if you sort of hit on one side, you get $5. Imagine the coin hits the other side, you get slapped. Right? I mean, not bad overall, you're going to take the chance. Now imagine we sort of keep increasing the stakes. You might get $1,000, but on the other hand, you can hit the other side, the wrong side. You lose one of your fingers with a bolt cutter. As you might be starting to realise, hang on, this is starting to look pretty bad. Again, suddenly, it doesn't quite feel as balanced in terms of rewarding all that. I mean, great if you get $1,000, but if you lose a finger with a bolt cutter, that's not so fun. And that's in a sort of very rough sense variance. Again, it's sort of the difference between, the results you can sort of draw or get with RNG. And that's sort of, I think, the big difference there between companies 1 and companies 2. I mean, a good example with the game that sort of really increasingly relies heavily on variance. For example, is Hearthstone, for those who play that. The game is heavily built around just RNG with high variance. I get just this overpowered follower there and, cheated out without any penalties, or, you get a really terrible one that actually screws you over. And that, in that sense, it also just sort of typifies, and again, also typifies how they try to balance it in case of Blizzard, because, again, you can pull a really great result, you can pull a really terrible result. And in that case, they sort of think, it balances up, but it's not particularly fun for the guy on the other side, depending how it goes, because, his skill, all his stuff, it doesn't really matter. Either you lose that because you got a really terrible result that sinks him, or, he loses because you got an amazing result that sinks him. I mean, that's not particularly fun. I mean, in that sense, again, this is, again, the problem with the variance that arises again, because it can really just sort of remove a lot of sort of, essentially choice from the player, and can also remove any feeling of choice from the player. And that's, again, that's why it has to be a bit careful. And again, that's also where I think companies 1, and this is probably one of the things that, again, just doesn't get talked about a lot, actually did it quite well, because, obviously, again, in certain things, you can't just really, sort of determine, really heavily, how things are going to go. I mean, you have to have some variance, again, because again, you have to render stuff either highly true, regular, which just makes it a bit crazy in its own way, or, again, it just, becomes true and predictable. There's other things there. But essentially, I mean, the way Companies 1 did it, and again, which doesn't get talked about, which is one we'll get into before I just try to hit him out of mind for another metaphor, but basically, it did it by, actually controlling its RNG or having mitigators for it. That's really important. It basically meant that there were sort of various ways for you to sort of control the variance as such, or there were ways for the variance to be controlled, or yet ways to sort of, in case, again, you got hit by a high variance roll, again, you get a unit wipe, there were ways, so it didn't feel so bad. There were ways to recover. There were mitigators for it. And, that's, the really important part of that, or they just sort of lowered the variance to a degree. I mean, for example, take, lower variance rolls. Again, we have armor. Again, in companies 2, again, they pretty much, as I made a video about, pretty much in many cases with the Germans, render it largely useless. Because, I mean, there's just either you penetrate or you don't. And if you don't, you get no damage. Sucks to be you, right? And that sort of basically lets people just, nerf armor, buff anti-tank until the point again where German armor doesn't particularly matter. I mean, in Companies 1, there was also really good German armor, but there was never quite the same level. Then they certainly didn't remove it, rendered useless. And that was in part because, again, there was less variance in a sense. I mean, if you didn't penetrate, you could still do damage. Not a lot, but there'd still be damage. There'd be less sense of frustration. Again, there'd still be some sense of control. Again, there'd also be that, something there, but, maybe also more encouraged to then try and flank. And even then, you sort of flank, you didn't get a penetrating hit. You still get some damage in there. So, in that way, there were still, things happening. You weren't just having all of your effort just completely negated because, you failed a roll. Compared to, again, in Companies 2, you fail a roll, boop, nothing happens, right? It feels bad. Again, that's sort of, again, one of those cases, just high variance, but also just artillery. In Companies 1, because it's not really a way to, mitigate artillery damage. Obviously, that'd be silly, oh, hey, my guys took a direct hit and somehow, Jack survived. That's not quite alright. So rather than do that, well, of course, what they did is they added mitigators, right? So just in that way, so even you lose units, it doesn't feel so bad. You have medic bunkers, medic tents, all that, that way. So if you lose units, or at least that way, you have a way of recovering the wounded. That way, slow building up, and showing that even as you lose stuff, even to other sorts of RNG, weapon RNG, you know, again, there's slightly variance in there, how much shots can hit and all that. So again, if you just like get really lucky, again, it doesn't feel so bad. Tanks can shoot, again, get super lucky hits again. All of these, you know, sort of small ways of, you know, just, you know, high rolling. You know, the medic bunkers in that sense can just help compensate for it by, again, recovering your wounded, sort of building up squads. Again, in this case, in Companies 1, they sort of had the issue with the Variant. Again, they sort of allowed them to get a really good premium, in a sense, infantry unit, not quite elite, but, you know, not folks going to desire, which of course will get really great veterans bonus you purchase from it. In this regard, there's a bit of a design flaw, similar to the sniper, but that was, I think, not an excuse then, of course, to entirely remove it like they did in Companies 2. Again, in that sense, in Companies 2, I mean, you got sort of doctrinal abilities, but at the same time, it's not really the same thing. It's not quite, you know, easy to remember. And of course, also doctrinal. So it's ultimately, it's not the same thing. It's not quite there to sort of mitigate those sorts of losses, and thusly, it doesn't quite work in the same way. And ultimately, again, particularly for the Wehrmacht, it suffers much more from these, again, high, you know, rolls, you know, with artillery attacks and all that. And again, there's nothing to compensate for it. Though in this case, with the Wehrmacht in Companies 1, they also added stuff like the Knights Crossholders, again, a super elite infantry unit at the farthest end of the tier, which of course also certainly is a good design for just encouraging to go there, but also help you ensure that even if you suffered heavy losses of the Wehrmacht, there was ways to further compensate for rather than just having to fully rely on medic bunkers. And again, similarly in Companies 2, there's nothing there. You hit tier 4s of the Wehrmacht, there's nothing. You know, there's tanks, but there's no, you know, infantry units to help compensate again for those high variance losses. And that's sort of, again, you know, just some of the things that are sort of directly compatible from Companies 1 to Companies 2. In Companies 2, we also got abandoned tanks, and again, there's another case of high variance. Again, either the tank's abandoned or it's not. And of course, you can't really say, well, there's no in-between. Like, you know, it's not just like, you know, slightly abandoned. You know, there's still one guy in there reading comics or something. So what we do there, I mean, again, this is where we then add sort of controllable elements. Again, but your suggestion, you know, like, depending on the state of tank damage, you can then sort of, you know, control how big a chance is. And of course, it becomes more, you know, understandable for the player around you as well. He got abandoned, but in this case, oh, he got immobilized. Oh, then it got abandoned. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways, you know, for this sort of, I would say, work through in a lot more interesting ways. And again, I mean, if we sort of look at, you know, all the things that Tim complain about in terms of RNG, again, it just tends to boil down to the fact that, again, like, it's just high variance rolls. Like, either, you know, something really great happens or nothing happens or something bad happens. It's just like there's never an in-between ground, or there's just too big of an extreme between the two results. Or in the case of artillery, again, there's nothing to mitigate it. There's nothing to sort of just make you feel less bad, because mechanically there is a safety net to help, you know, make sure the frustration doesn't build up too much. And lastly, I do think that is I think one of the sort of bigger problems sort of rose in Companies 2, again, which never really got talked about, because again, when you talk about RNG, you just sort of tend to see it just in black and white. Again, you just only see the coin flips. You don't necessarily just, you know, think about the whole, you know, variance bit, like, you know, does it have to make sense? That can somewhere, you know, mitigate. Just look, well, if it's bad, you know, we somehow have to, you know, lessen it in other ways. And again, but in this case of the Wehrmacht front line, we just completely remove it. So I mean, essentially, the coin flip is gone. Great, but it also means the Wehrmacht front alarm is essentially gone, meaning the mechanic has been rendered utterly useless. It's been neutered, rather than just actually trying to fix it like they did in Companies 1, which was add deflection. So, in that sense, you know, coin flipping can also just somehow actually stymie the discussion, because again, when people just talk about RNG, they just talk about, oh, it's random, but they never talk about the results, and they then try to talk about in a proper way, you know, mitigating the results somehow, making them feel less extreme, but still, you know, palpable. And thusly ensuring the mechanic still works. I mean, had that happened, you know, who knows, Wehrmacht armor might not have been quite rendered as utterly useless as it currently is. I mean, again, most players go for Panzer IVs because, well, by Jove, that's what works. So, I do think, again, you know, this is an interesting discussion to have, and probably, again, for Companies 2, it's too late to have. I mean, who knows, they might, you know, end up doing some kind of big patch with a sort of overhaul armor and do deflection, which, again, would be amazing. But I think there's got to be a lot part of this is just, you know, it's never going to be implemented. For say for Companies 3, I mean, I think this is a really good discussion to have, because it kind of feels like, you know, the developers, and again, I don't have anything against them in that regard, but you might just overlooked the importance of, you know, controlling variance in different matters for Companies 2, and just look, well, there's RNG in Company Heroes. Great, we can just do that in Companies 2, but again, they overlooked the ways the developers in Companies 1, and, you know, just, you know, mitigated or controlled it, you know, in short, there were ways so it doesn't feel quite as horrible when, you know, you get high rolled. So, that's sort of, you know, my thoughts on the subject matter, sort of a bit more game mechanical, game design wise, and again, talking about RNG and variance. Now, not usually what I talk about, but I figured sort of really want to get into it because it's something that's increasingly in my mind as I talked about the different parts I've already talked about in videos, and of course, so I figured just trying to maybe tie together it all in one, more specific video about RNG and variance. So I hope you like this video. I hope it sort of helps you understand some of the things here, maybe gives you some food for thought. If you did, subscribe, like, share, comment, all that. And if you like what I do consider donating or pledging on Patreon. Links in the video description. This is Imperial Dane signing off. See you all another time for another video. Cheers.